the Centre for 18th Century Studies. So welcome 18th Century Studies people. We have an audience online joining us through Teams as well, so you're very welcome also. So our speaker today is Dr. Patrick Walsh, well known to many people here in Queens. Patrick is Associate Professor of 18th Century Irish History at Trinity College Dublin. And he's also the co-PI of the Trinity Colonial Legacies Project, along with Kieran O'Neill. Patrick is former general editor of 18th Century Ireland and has published widely on many aspects of 18th century Irish history, with books including The Making of the Irish Protestant Ascendancy, The Life of William Connolly in 2010, and The South Sea Bubble and Ireland, Money, Banking and Investment, 1691 to 1721, published in 2014. And Patrick's going to talk to us today about current research he's carrying out on the development of the 18th century Irish state, a colonial sinew of power, rethinking the 18th century Irish state. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to Moira as well for the joint invitation to this seminar. The paper, I suppose, emerges out of a current book project, a long-running. Some degree it started around the time I finished my last book, and it's had various hiatuses for various reasons on the state in 18th century Ireland. And I'm going to begin by briefly explaining what I'm trying to do in that wider project before digging deeper into a case study drawn on one of the chapters I've been working on this term. I've been on sabbatical this term, which has given me a chance to get back to some of this work and away from Trinity Colonial Legacies, which has been no bad thing. And this book began as a project focused on exploring an Irish version of the fiscal military state, with an emphasis on understanding how Ireland fitted into what's become, I suppose, a key paradigm for understanding state formation across Europe, and more recently, many of Europe's Atlantic colonies. The term has been used everywhere from and across Southeast Asia. Has now been used almost globally. To some degree, lost some of its analytical vigor with that, perhaps. But that remains an important element. But increasingly, I've become more interested in understanding how the state's authority was performed at its margins, how we think about state formation, not from either the metropolitan or provincial or even colonial centre, but from the outside in. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Many of the stories I use to frame my book are told from the fragmented edges of the state, rather than from the centre, from isolated peninsulas on Ireland's Atlantic edge, from boggy mountainsides and upland regions, from villages and communities often bypassed in more established narratives of modernisation and centralisation. And to some degree, the book is structured around a series of sort of case studies and stories which interject with some of the main themes. And we get to one of those a little bit later. And in doing so, I'm trying to avoid the temptation to replicate a metropolitan English historiographical model onto different Irish circumstances, which to some degree is where when I first conceived this, about 2011, I think that's where I was going, namely the concept of the fiscal military state as conceived by John Brewer, to make Ireland, in other words, simply another imperial sinew of power. Instead, the argument of this book, while cognizant of the development of the fiscal and military apparatuses of the Irish colonial state, derives its inspiration from two very different, but I suppose imaginative approaches to understanding historical geographies of power. Firstly, it draws on David Gange's provocative arguments in his frayed Atlantic edge, who, insanely perhaps, University of Birmingham historian, navigated around these islands in a canoe from the outside, to look at these islands from the outside in. It's a remarkable sort of immersive, literally, historical approach. But his book has a number of really useful insights, not least the warning that too often histories are written from the inside out, leading to accounts that privilege cities at the expense of more marginal coastal regions, and the idea that regions that are no longer important but were once important need to be understood in their own terms. He explains how ideas of modernity and improvement might be problematized and recast if viewed from the coast rather than from the centre. And I want to argue that an outside-in view of state formation likewise significantly complicates our preconceptions of the domestic and colonial impact of the state. The Irish state cannot be understood solely within its metropolitan or urban hubs, even if we think of those key urban hubs as hubs within a wider sort of imperial state. Cork is the sort of example, Sinew here. The webs of state power extended across the kingdom though often not in straightforward patterns. And considering these patterns helps to eschew a teleological reading of the Irish state by encouraging us to think about developments and processes that did not lead to the modern apparatus of the 19th century state under the Union, let alone the structures of the modern state in independent Ireland. To understand the contingent nature of state power, I draw upon legal historian Lauren Benton's concept of stringy sovereignty, with its emphasis on the elasticity of state power in more remote and upland regions, and the consequent needs to pay attention to the ways that this shaped colonial and state practice in these regions, furthest from the centre of power. This is especially helpful when considering Ireland with its awkward and much debated status as neither a kingdom or a colony. I'm not going to go near that today, for good reason. And Benton's work on sovereignty, as applied by the late Aaron Graham to what he terms British Jamaica and British Ireland in a provocative comparison, is very useful in teasing out this historiographical tension, acknowledging Ireland's constitutional status as a separate kingdom, a legal status which marked it out as a de jure, if not de facto, different to colonies like Jamaica. He focused on contingencies built into the processes of making legislation in Kingstown and Dublin, showing how the colonial assembly in Jamaica and the Parliament in Ireland interacted with the imperial government in council in London. He used Benton's conceptualisation of the increasingly stringy nature of sovereignty to further one travelled from the centre to demonstrate how understandings of Ireland's complex status might be reconfigured through comparative analysis. And I think there's much to learn from this. And his analysis of Jamaica, like William Godsey's very different work on Lower Austria, demonstrates how it's possible to write about a fiscal military state with a non-national focus, and indeed how in the world of composite and colonial states, the sovereign unitary state should be seen as the exception. And again, David's work on composite states many years ago, I think, illustrates this very well. Instead, the dependent nature of the Anglo-Irish relationship with its unequal power dynamics led to the consolidation of a colonial form of governance designed to extract military and financial resources from Ireland to benefit the wider fiscal military project of the English imperial state. And we can see to some degree the structure of the imperial state in this diagram here, and we can work this either way. It's a reversible flowchart where taxes collected in the Irish provinces, often with the aid of the military, so symbolised here by the Royal Barracks in Dublin, and flow into the Custom House, flow to the House of Commons to be spent, or alternatively MPs in College Green vote the taxes collected by the bureaucracy to pay the army to be deployed elsewhere in the empire. So it gives us a sense of that sort of flow. And I argue that while Ireland occupied an ambiguous place within the British-Irish polity, Irish resources, first money, then money and men, as Ivor McGrath has demonstrated, were extracted from Ireland by increasingly bureaucratic and efficient state institutions to support the projection of power abroad, helping to shape the emergence of England as a major global power. This extractive relationship can be termed colonial if we follow the definition of colonialism proffered by Jürgen Osterhammel as a system of domination whereby the colonised territory is forced to serve the interests of the coloniser. You can nuance this a bit further, but thinking about the work of Bernard Shaw on resource zones, so we remember Andrew McKillop talking about this last year in this room, which emerged across Europe to serve overseas colonial projects. And my research integrates the framework of colonialism with the concept of the fiscal military state. It demonstrates that while it's possible to trace elements of bureaucratic imperialism and the transfer of English patterns and modes of governance can be particularly identified on the fiscal side, this study is not simply a story of the replication of the English, but one that was inflected with colonialism. Ireland thus becomes a colonial sinew of power, hence my title. And the colonial nature of the relationship between the governing and the governed is in some ways best viewed from these frayed edges of the state, where state power was not always what it seemed. And a rare surviving letter from a military officer stationed in the military barracks in Dingle or Dangan-on-Cooch, County Kerry, in 1702 provides a tantalising vignette. Writing to Dublin Castle from within the officers' quarters, one Captain Whitall Brown described how the Mass House, being so nigh the barracks here, the sovereign, or the mayor, and I have ordered the priest to say no more Mass. Instead, they were to be allowed to have Mass in another place, further off from my guards. And his reasoning for asking the priest to move the site of his Mass was not because it contravened the penal laws, it didn't, but rather because, as he put it, The barrack is a long, defenceless house within 20 yards of the mass house, to which 300 or 400 persons resort to on Sundays and other holy days, and therefore is a danger of surprise. And we have a very similar account from a barracks in Roscommon, which is also built jutting to the mass house. And this letter is highly illuminating about the power dynamics at play in rural Ireland at the turn of the 18th century. Fear and paranoia about a potentially hostile population who they did not understand characterised the reaction of the soldiers stationed in Ireland to their surroundings. This sense of misunderstanding and foreboding must have been heightened in Dingle, not just by Catholicism, but also by the use of the Irish language, an important element within this story, largely beyond my scope today, though we can get another sense of that. This extraordinary, one of my PhD students discovered this in the Caldwell papers in Manchester this summer, which just gives a sense of the sort of a military perspective on the Irish language and just the difficulties of soldiering in Ireland. So we have here at the end, as strangers not knowing the language, the tempers of the natives of the country, so that this food and this shelter they be able to procure by force only. This was part of an argument that only local militia were suitable to prosecute excise offenders and the illegal distillers in Cavan and Fermanagh, and they extended foreigner to people from Louth. So there's a limit. There's a sort of extension here. But it's a really striking vignette, I think, in some ways, of what it tells us. But back to Whitehall Brown. Brown's reaction to the convergence of the Dingle residents on the local mass house also warns us to be wary of assuming the direction of power dynamics based on the presence of what seems like the visible and therefore imposing infrastructure of the state. Viewing Surveyor General William Robinson's 1700 distribution map of the first wave of barracks constructed or occupied by William III's peacetime standing army after 16 is drawn to the coloured flags marking out each barrack or redoubt on this map. Each barrack coloured flag denoting its regiment and whether it housed cavalry or infantry. Further circular lines on the map depicted the hinterlands of each regiment. This cartographic depiction of the military establishment was designed to impress a sense of order on the viewer, who presumably encountered it in an official setting in Dublin Castle or in Whitehall. Soldiers, it appeared, were stationed everywhere, though if you look closely, there's a lot less of them on the far side of the Shannon. The ordered confidence projected by Robinson's map, however, concealed a more complex reality. Many of the barrack buildings depicted were not fit for purpose. And we think of the long defenceless house in Dingle, or we think of the barracks here in Johnston Fuse in South County Armagh, now part of a private house. Opposite it, you have a field, which was the market square, which is now a boggy field. It's an extraordinary site. John Johnston is another interesting character in this story, but I'm not going to go near him today. It's been covered very well by Tim Watt. But they're often adaptations of existing domestic buildings or to the remnants of medieval fortified structures. In other cases, the map conceals just how potentially isolated their physical situation was. Though we should be conscious of the theorist Albert Memmi's astute observation on the garrisoning of colonial frontiers. How else can one explain how a garrison of a few men can hold out in a mountain post? They know very well that if they're in danger, their lonely position would quickly be changed. And reading these lines, I was struck by thinking about some of the redoubts and smaller barracks that we find in North Munster in the early part of the 18th century, in South Ulster, thinking particularly of a research trip I did with Timothy Watt and Ivor McGrath about 10 years ago in South Armagh, looking at Blackbank, Hamilton's Spawn, Johnson's of the Fuse, and these small isolated spots, and how we might think about how they were used. But in the time remaining today, I want to think about one of these lonely positions, but digging deeper into an extraordinary family narrative from West Cork, which allows me to unpick some of my wider themes. So, the critical piece here, this is from an extraordinary memoir. The critical line here is the final line on that slide. Courage, my dear children. Their cannonballs have no more effect on our stone walls than if it were so many apples. With these words of dubious parenting advice, disguised as comfort, Reverend James Fontaine, a Huguenot clergyman in West Cork, reassured his young children as they set about defending their semi-fortified house 5 miles east of Castletown Bearhaven from Franco-Irish privateers on a long summer's day in June 1704. A 10-gun French ship with a crew of 80 men, a mix of French and Irish sailors, had set her anchor off Bearhaven early that morning, seeking to raid the Irish coast. Such privateering missions were an important part of French military strategy during the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 13, with private military entrepreneurs from the Breton ports of Brest and Saint-Malo regularly sending vessels into Ireland's southern waters. They often employed guides drawn from the Irish Catholic emigre community, who could act as intermediaries with local bands of Rapparees or Tory, acting as informants on the location of the richest sources of potential plunder. And the target of this raid was the fortified house of James Fontaine, who had, in less than a decade after arriving in West Cork, garnered a reputation as a fearless and capable agent of the state. Born Jacques Fontaine to a French Huguenot family, he had left France for England along with thousands of his co-religionists in 1685. Settling first in the Devon port of Barnstaple, he took holy orders and married a fellow French refugee, Anne-Elizabeth Bourgeois. A decade later, the French refugee migrated to Cork, where under the anglicised version of his name, James, he became a colonial settler, combining ministering to the city's Huguenot community with running a woolen manufactory. Following the mercantilist restrictions placed on the Irish woolen trade, in 1699, he, together with his young family, moved further westward to the Beara Peninsula. Here he continued to minister to his dispersed Protestant flock. According to a diocesan visitation in 1700, he was preaching in an alehouse in Skibbereen in the absence of formal church premises. Having abandoned his textile ventures, he invested his remaining capital in a fish curing business. And the Fontaines were part of a small Huguenot settler colony in West Cork, who hoped to profit from the bounty of the ocean. He described his hopes rather eloquently. "I was a preacher who hoped to become a fisherman, the opposite of the apostles. I regarded fishing as the most innocent of all work, because if one earns anything by it, if not by oppressing the poor, but from providence alone." The fishery enterprise was, however, part of the colonial process of improvement through commercial expansion, which settlers like Fontaine hoped would transform the local economy and society. This transformation would be a social as well as an economic and environmental one. The wooded and mountainous peninsulas of the southwest remained, after over a century of plantation policies, at the margins of Irish state power, with neither their social structure nor governance fully integrated into the colonial state. Those of you who were here for my paper on the Trinity Estates earlier in the term, the evidence from those papers is really quite striking on this sort of aspect, particularly in the woodlands. Such upland regions were the last refuges of armed gangs of Rapparees or Tory, who often enjoyed the protection of the peasantry. Viewed from Dublin or even from Cork, these were remote and barbarous places. Viewed from the coast, they were, however, well-connected, outward-looking maritime zones within a wider Atlantic world. The small ports of southwest Munster had long-standing outward connections to the European continent to establish legal trading and fishing links, as well as illegal but wealth-generating smuggling connections. These widespread maritime connections have led Mark Cable to persuasively argue, I think, that neighbouring County Kerry can be best understood not as a remote periphery of a Dublin-centred state, but instead following David Armitage's influential typology as a cis-Atlantic region connected into and drawing its life force from the Western Ocean. On much of what Cable says about Kerry, he wouldn't like this, you can say about Cork, and you can say about parts of West Donegal, and I've been going back to look at South Donegal, some of the areas that I looked at a long time ago, looking at the Connolly estates and around Ballyshannon. You could create the same sort of story using Ballyshannon, and the new Historic Towns Atlas draws out these connections really well for that particular port. These southwestern regions' liminal status was understood by contemporaries, with the commander of the forces stationed in Ireland, Lord John Cutts, recognising in 1706 that maritime settlements like Crookhaven, Skibbereen and Bearhaven were in effect our frontier. That's his words. Despite this, he was reluctant, even during wartime, to authorise the quartering of more troops in what he called far-flung places along the coast. Ireland's place in the strategic thinking of the fiscal-military state remained marginal, even as Atlantic shipping routes became more important to English naval supremacy. Watching and protecting Britain and Ireland's western maritime frontier was therefore largely devolved to an uneven and patchwork network of local state officers, men like Fontaine, clergyman, fishery entrepreneur and justice of the peace, who together threaded the strings of sovereignty on the fragmented edges of the colonial state. Upon arrival in Bearhaven, he quickly assimilated into the local governing elite, declaring in his 1722 unpublished memoir that he was the only person in the barony concerned with the Protestant interest. Here he contrasted himself with both the remnants of the old Gaelic order who dominated the baronial manor courts. Fontaine, with the zeal of an outsider, took a less accommodationist approach. Upon nomination to the county magistracy as a justice of the peace in 1702, he took his duties very seriously, later explaining how he loved doing justice to the Irish. He was responsible, by his own account, for dispatching 8 to 10 rapparees to each session of the county assizes for trial, and his vigorous pursuit of rapparees across the barony led to violent threats from the men in the woods, as he termed them, with their leader, one Skelton, warning Fontaine they would surprise him some day or another. And such threats were part and parcel of the experience of active office holders in marginal regions like southwest Munster, where Protestants found themselves isolated in numbers and influence. The interventionist militia colonel Richard Hedges, well known to some here, noted, for instance, how there were 2 other Protestants, a clergyman and his son, resident in the vast tract of space between the market town of Kanturk and Sir Richard Cox's plantation estate of Dunmanway. Furthermore, he dismissively noted that they did not and never would put their hands to the plough, and one presumes a musket. This sense of isolation helps to explain the willingness of Fontaine's Protestant neighbours to turn a blind eye to illegal activity along the coast. Fontaine's willingness to face down local rapparees was therefore brave, if perhaps foolhardy. Skelton's threatened ambushes, or what he called Fox's War, was however averted by internal disputes within the gang, leading to their disintegration. The activities of rapparees like Skelton caused significant disruption for local property classes. Fears of assault and being stripped on the roads were, according to a 1702 proclamation, preventing people from travelling to markets, limiting the expansion of commerce into remote regions where policymakers still hoped to encourage Protestant strangers to plant and inhabit as part of the continuing colonial project to make Ireland English. This continuity of the colonial plantation ideology of westward expansion is vital to understanding the Tory War prosecuted by Hedges on Fontaine in the baronies of Muskerry and Beara, even if they retained a detached relationship with central government. And the ambivalence shown by the central government to proposals for defence of the western frontier was made clear when James Butler, 2nd Duke of Ormond, then Lord Lieutenant, conducted a tour of Munster in autumn 1703. On this occasion, Fontaine and some of his fellow West Cork magistrates, supported by the Cork political grandee, Sir Richard Cox, travelled to Kinsale to seek an audience with the Duke. And Cox had long argued for greater naval establishment at Kinsale to command the western approaches to Britain and Ireland, even including it in a sketch for a prospective legislative union in 1699. Rereading this quote this morning, I was struck by how this would fit into the Irish Times these days with the sort of NATO shillers. We have a sense here, it's certain that a squadron at Kinsale would be more secure our commerce and offend an enemy than all the fleet of England in the Downs or Portsmouth. But by this union, Ireland will be part of England, and the English will have greater opportunities of trade and purchase, providing for their children than they now have, and ease themselves of taxes. And such grand projects for a union were not on the agenda, at least in Kinsale in 1703, though perhaps elsewhere. But the greater demands on taxation occasioned by England's war effort over the previous 2 years might have helped find a ready audience for his fiscal argument. On this occasion, Fontaine was delegated to use his isolated situation to plead before Ormond, who was sympathetic to his situation in such a barbarous country, but was unwilling to divert funds or resources. A similar proposal for a fort at Crookhaven on the opposite side of Bantry Bay was also rejected. In that case, a private entrepreneur, the English settler Pierce Arnop, as Tim Watt has shown, took on the financial and military risk, instead erecting a battery to protect the Deepwater harbour. Otherwise, the only government intervention during the war was a Privy Council proclamation requiring the crews of fishing boats off this coast to be made up of at least 1/3 Protestants. The enforcement and impact of such crude sectarian demographic engineering, I think we can assume, was limited, and we can see this from other sources. We know that naval recruitment, even in Kinsale in 1704, the town of Edward Suddle, the Irish Chief Secretary at the time, was actively encouraging the Admiralty to recruit Irish Catholics, strong, lusty men, as he called them, into the Navy, in contravention to the penal laws but with a sort of grey area that they weren't bearing arms aboard ships, so therefore they were fine and they were being shipped far away. And again, there's another part of this story that I'm trying to connect is the sort of wider story of naval recruitment and seaborne recruitment. It's an important and understudied area. Fontaine, in the absence of further state support, decided to secure his own property on a more modest scale, adding a tower to the stone house he'd built on first arriving in Bearhaven. He would be thankful for the stone walls and the new slated roof. But 9 months after his audience with Ormond, the French arrived in the creek below his house. The alarm was raised by one of his servants tending to his cattle, and immediately aware of the imminent danger to his property, Fontaine sought to create the illusion that he had greater military resources under his command. In his memoir, he explains how he mustered and armed 20 men, the Protestants with muskets, the Papists with clubs. Even now, in this moment of crisis, paying attention to the legislation disarming Catholics. Through skillful manoeuvring and calculated deception, he made it appear like he doubled the number of his followers, and this feint allowed him to barricade his house, I love this bit, with sheep's fleeces, mattresses, and large books. Having dismissed his unarmed Catholic servants, he then, with his loyal Protestant retainers, his wife Anne Elizabeth and his children, prepared for a siege. And over the course of the day, they held off the cannonading privateer crew, killing 3 of the attackers and wounding 7. By late afternoon, the French sailors had retreated their ship and eventually sailed away, much to the disappointment of the 200 to 300 Irishmen collected on a neighbouring height who were waiting impatiently for the moment when they might come down and help plunder. And the presence of this chorus line watching the battle below adds to Fontaine's retelling of the performance of his providential defence of his family house, of his family, of his house, and of his kingdom. It also speaks to the aminosity that the presence of what a later folklore account called his Huguenot gang had generated in the short time since their first arrival, and the drama, as observed from the hills, entered local folklore, with Fontaine unsurprisingly cast as the villain. And this memoir describes this episode in the form of a heroic narrative, which adds further lustre to his already dramatic chronicle of his adventures from his turbulent youth in Louis XIV's France, through to the defence of his West Cork colonial stockade. And this version of the battle was not, however, just a later construction, constructed for posterity and for the edification of his sons on their Virginia plantations in the 1720s. Fontaine had immediately recognised the drama of his family's stand on the frontier of Protestant Ireland, and he sought to capitalise on his glorious victory, writing to Beaucox and to Ormond, seeking their approbation of his conduct and their favour for the future. According to his own version of events, his family's unlikely defeat of the privateers was reported in gazettes across Europe. Though scanning any available newspaper, I have yet to find any evidence of this. A skirmish in a farmyard on Ireland's southern frontier had been elevated to become an international event. Shades of Widow McCormack. In a sign of official gratitude, 1 barrel of gunpowder and 2 more musket balls were immediately dispatched from the garrison at Charles Fort in Kinsale. The provision of regular soldiers to use them continued to prove elusive. Instead, Fontaine was expected to continue to guard the coast on his own initiative. To this end, he expended considerable effort and money, increasing his own domestic defences, acquiring several small cannons which had been fished up from a vessel lost at sea, which he mounted on a fortification of turf, with a parapet of 18 feet in thickness. The construction of this sod fort and his diligence in securing the remote part he lives in, so described, led to the granting of an official pension by royal warrant in 1705, and the state's monopoly on violence, and the defence of this part of its western frontier had been subcontracted out to a private individual along with his wife, children, and servants. And this melding of formal state power and private settler interests was inherently, I would argue, colonial in form. Men had arrived in boats, built fortifications, made claims to authority, drawing on divine providence, and began to exploit local natural resources. As we have seen, he combined his clerical duties with his attempts to establish a fish export business, along with taking on the role of the JP. It was not unusual for clergymen to double up as JPs, reflecting the paucity of suitable property of Protestants. But it does draw attention to the interlayering of the confessional and administrative states in Ireland. And the tensions this could create can be seen in the ways that Fontaine describes his interactions with his Irish neighbours, who are from the beginning of his narrative cast as treacherous, barbarous, or robbers, determined to plunder his home. And the alliance of local rapparees, especially the Sullivans, descendants of the former local lords, with the French was especially offensive to him. He was, after all, not just an active servant of the colonial state in Ireland, but also an exiled Frenchman with his own hereditary antipathy to Louis XIV and his forces that went beyond the current war. This created a further barrier between him and the local community and likely contributed to the animosity developed on both sides, along with the zealous pursuit of some members of the O'Sullivan clan. These animosities were exacerbated by his victory in June 1704 and the subsequent improvements to his sod fort. There were minor further skirmishes and at least one cattle raid, but it wasn't until October 1708 that a second sustained attempt was made. This time there were regular soldiers quartered amongst the Irish, but through a combination of absentee officers, a drunken ensign, and the scattering of the soldiers on patrol through the barony, they proved ineffectual. The defence of his house was left again to the family and to their cowherds. On this occasion, they were unable to thwart their Hiberno-French attackers, who were led by West Cork native Tyke Carty, who set fire to the malt house and other outbuildings, forcing Fontaine, being injured in the crossfire, to surrender. This he did grudgingly, but only on condition the negotiations over terms would take place not in English but in French, with a representative of the French officers, since he was an English subject, whose nation was at war with France. In the end, he's forced to treat with an Irish-born French officer and one of the Cartys. And upon their surrender, the family home was plundered of all its contents, including books. And Fontaine himself was taken aboard the French vessel with the expectation of being taken to St. Malo. There was to be further twists in the story. His wife Anne attempted to first enlist a local Catholic priest's support to help release her husband, but her entreaties and then threats were met with indifference, if not active hostility. Any sense of ecumenical mutual obligation needed to be earned by prior actions as well as words. She then sought to negotiate with the French captain, speaking with him through a speaking trumpet from the top of the cliff opposite Jersey Island. One can imagine the scene, where the cable car is perhaps today. A prisoner exchange was agreed, with her second son, Peter, taking the place of his injured father, with an agreed ransom bond of £100. And the eldest son, James, was protecting the ransacked family farm. The injured father was taken ashore to receive medical treatment, and the son sailed for St. Malo, and his mother rode to Cork to borrow the ransom money from the bishop. No ransom was ever paid. Instead, the machinery of international diplomacy took over, with retaliatory action taken on the bodies of French prisoners at Kinsale and Plymouth, who were put in irons. Word of this punishment got to Brittany. Peter Fontaine was speedily sent back to Ireland. The family, meanwhile, secured significant financial compensation from both the Privy Council in Dublin and from the Cork Grand Jury for the loss of their property, in accordance with the provisions of the 1697 Rapparee Act. The dramatic story of James Fontaine and his family has its own distinctive, even unique elements, but in its broader contours, it reveals much about the nature of government and state power on Ireland's fragmented edges. Power could be devolved to local interests, domestic households that could become the stage for its performance, with the actors drawn from within the family, from their retainers and from their servants. Life on the Irish frontier, as in other colonial borderlands, was lived on the edge of the law, with law officers like Fontaine required to adapt to their circumstances to protect both their own propertied interests and the sovereignty of the state. Violence was routine and could be brutal. On occasions, it could even be fatal. Relationships with the native Gaelic Irish community were fractious, if not fractured, and judging by the account of Anne Elizabeth Fontaine's failed negotiations with the Catholic priest, acts of mercy and the sort of benevolent tyranny practiced elsewhere in remote regions of the British composite state were less prevalent. And her encounter with the priest in his mass house and her husband's earlier experiences at the baronial court, dominated by the residual Gaelic interest, remind us that the power and sovereignty of both the confessional and administrative states continued to be contested. Decentering the state and viewing it from its Atlantic edges brings such contests and encounters into sharp relief. It shows how the structures both of local government and of the fiscal military state were required to be adaptable to meet local contexts, but also how consensual forms of governance were underpinned by colonial logic and coercive system which could be deployed to enforce state power. Personal character mattered, and a longer chapter this episode is drawn from are bringing other exemplars of the frontier mentality encapsulated by the Fontaines. Buildings mattered, and as I argue elsewhere in my ongoing work, so did horses. These elements come together in a 1730s survey of the revenue establishment, which paid close attention to the housing of revenue officials, recognising their frequent status as isolated but conspicuously visible representatives of the state, not unlike Fontaine in his sod fort. Their houses and stables became effectively informal parts of the state infrastructure. Like Fontaine's sod fort, they likewise occupied a liminal space between domestic residences and the militarized, still largely residential barracks network described earlier. They were defensive structures built to protect their owners, but also to lay down a marker of the authority that magistrates like Fontaine hoped to project in their neighbourhoods. Such authority could, however, be ephemeral, depending either on political patronage or family circumstances. The days of the sod fort were, it turns out, numbered. Following his ordeal in 1708, Reverend Fontaine moved to Dublin, where he leased a townhouse on St. Stephen's Green and set himself up as a teacher of mathematics and as an expert in fortifications. His eldest son, also James, was nominated to the Cork Commission of the Peace, in his stead becoming a magistrate in 1710. Within 5 years, however, the younger James Fontaine had sold the family leasehold interests in Bearhaven, and together with his two brothers, the newly ordained Peter of the Ship and John, he continued the family's westward trajectory that had begun a generation earlier in Nantes, becoming colonial settlers and then plantation owners in Virginia. Having spent their formative years defending the British state in Ireland, they were now operating on the new frontiers of the imperial state, bringing with them intergenerational memories and colonial mentalities that continued to shape their identity. And there was a final coda, apparently, amongst the descendants of the servants who defended the sod fort in 1708 with one Davy Crockett of the Alamo. We'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was excellent. Really lively picture of encounters in South and West Munster near the 18th century. We'll open it up for questions. So if anyone online joining us wants to ask a question, either type a question into the text box or raise your hand digitally, and Becca will let us know. But we'll start with the room. Who would like to open up Q&A to start? Sophie.
And she kind of reminded me of a lot of the women that we hear about in the pre-17th century, the kind of strong Irish woman who's off. And I'm just wondering how that fits in with the images that we often get of the frontierswoman, and whether there's any kind of, if you have any kind of reflections from that. It's very vague.
Yeah, no, I see what you're getting at. I'm immediately thinking of sort of Lemonna Castle and things like that. But yeah, so there is this sort of tradition almost of these stereotypical sort of Irish women defending their homesteads in the 1640s and 50s. Yeah, it's hard. I find her intriguing because she's very prominent in the story. She has a critical sort of agency in it, and so often we don't get female voices in these sort of pictures. And I think it is very much their story, and they're both recognized in the pension, and they both have, and I think that's quite interesting. That is interesting itself. Where we in so much of what we know about sort of women in rural Irish society in sort of engaged in political things is so vague to be. There's a William Bike article on sort of female rioters in France, which everybody decides to say, yeah, this must have been happening. So even when I've been looking at a lot of sort of taxation, sort of disaffection, and that's been one of the major things I've been tracking, sort of smuggling and riots, sort of encounters, trying to map them and trying to understand the sort of geographies and sort of crowd dynamics and so forth. And we know that they're multi-gendered crowds, but beyond that, there's so little. I would hesitate to describe a typology of the Irish frontierswoman. Like we have, the isolated examples. There's a woman, Eliza O'Neill, in the Hearts of Steel sort of documentation, 1770, which gives another hint. There's various clerical wives, but that's as much as I would.
Where the Irish the very devout Irish Catholic, but living in the frontier of the US. And it's just interesting that the kind of imagery that we have of the kind of frontier woman in Ireland in the 16th, 17th, 18th century is seemingly kind of transferred to the frontier in the US. It was just when you were saying about Virginia and how there is that movement. It was just
no, like there is something about some of the tropes of the Irish, you can trace sort of tropes of the Irish frontier appearing in sort of certainly 18th century Pennsylvania in all sorts of ways in terms and languages and sort of community identities and so forth and things that it wouldn't surprise me at all. But beyond that, it's scanty evidence.
Yeah.
Patrick, the very professionalised management, even of his own household, where the Protestants get firearms and the Catholics get clubs.
Yes.
Is really interesting. Is it possible? So I wonder how characteristic is this kind of household management for this early 18th century period, or would you see, considering that he's a Huguenot, do you think he's actually best seen as kind of a late 17th century figure in some ways? And is it possible to periodize this and start to see a point at which Irish Protestants are prepared to trust their Catholic servants with firearms, and maybe kind of tell a story about household management in that way?
Yeah, it's very interesting. In the sort of the longer version of this, one of the things I've done is I've kind of compared sort of Fontaine's experience with a slightly more well-known example of a chap called Richard Hedges, who's this West Cork militia colonel, who has this extraordinary correspondence. And one of the things he's happy to do, but he has more power and he's more security in his role, that he's quite happy to arm papists, as he calls them, in pursuit of other of rapparees in his area. So there's a divergence, and he gets called up on this from Dublin Castle, that he's able to sort of defend himself, saying, well, look, what else am I going to do? There's nobody else around. And he keeps making this point, I am the only man in this county, which is not strictly true. But there are there are other examples of people willing to do that. So I think like Fontaine, to some degree, I think it seems like the way I would read that, it's a sort of just like caution about his own position and along with these trust issues. And he clearly has this. The whole thing is characterized in extremely sectarian terms, and every possible reference all the way through the narrative. So there is, whether that's a 17th century mindset or whether the long 17th century, where does the long 17th century stop? I'm not sure. I think you can track this over. You could certainly probably track that over time in terms of people getting worried about who has firearms. It comes into there has been some work done on this. There's a recent-ish King's PhD which gets into some of this, but doesn't really dig into the weeds to it. But you can get as at moments of crisis, firearms become a concern. It's like horses, and I've been more interested in tracking horses recently and trying to think about the penal laws about horses. Because one of the things I started noticing was that people attack horses as a form of as a representation of authority. So I've been trying to understand that in terms of as a projection of authority and how that fits, and then how people are using horses and renting horses in some cases even, and borrowing them to project their authority. So I think there are ways you can. So all of these things have a sort of it's not a linear chronology, it's a sort of crisis chronology with it and with a sort of geography. But yeah, I think there's probably something interesting in thinking about sort of the servant relationships. But like you get to the 1790s and you have people who trusted their servants, and suddenly they're like there's numerous accounts of people just like, I thought they loved me, sort of correspondence. And I'm thinking of Lady Louisa Connolly and Mariah Edgeworth, they're both brilliantly good on this as people who have seen themselves immersed in their communities, and suddenly they don't like us. So I think there is it's complex. Yeah.
Your friendship is very different to local rapparee in the Republic.
Yeah. Sure.
It's been a very long semester, so maybe I'm missing something. But I don't quite see, it's fascinating personal story from it. But what it tells us about Irish state, we already know about the problems of South Armagh right into the 18th century, with hawkers and Connaught. And none of this is defined to Ireland. I mean, think of Carl Winslow's study of the reign of terror of smugglers on the Sussex coast
Mhm.
by the 1730s. I mean, it's not all that unusual. And secondly, to be more constructive,
Mhm.
have you thought about Renshaw's classic article on banditry in Roman Empire, where the point he makes is that banditry is a transitional phase in the growth of the state. In other words, we have a very weak state, a late medieval state, very modern state. There is no rule of law in more remote areas for people to step outside. So banditry doesn't exist because there's no law to step outside. Banditry comes when the state is beginning to impose a rule of law, to the point where somebody who steps outside it becomes a man on the run, out of man's keeping, in the phrase it's used in Ireland. But where the state hasn't yet developed the resources to clamp down effectively on these people. So that what you're looking at here is a transitional stage in the creation of a centralized state.
Yeah, no, I think to take that, but yes, there is. I think there certainly is a sort of like I've thought about this a bit. There is a sort of within that sort of transitional. A lot of this is happening at these sort of moments in transition. That's what I'm like. What I'm talking about here is mostly sort of early example. I began to wonder about this a bit when I started digging into. I was trying to work out the sort of traditional sort of. I started with this sense that there's a sort of traditional chronology of sort of violent outbursts, which you mentioned all of the key sort of cases, and I started to worry about as you began looking at this through the prisms of sort of revenue records and trying to work out the sort of chronologies of sort of violence over time and geographical spread of sort of incidents, and try to work out how does this impact in terms of where the state is problematic and disintegrating and its authority is expanding or contracting at different stages. And what came out of that was that on one level it was disappointing that the critical moment turned out still to be around about 1760. The white boy sort of chronology. But what I've begun to, and I've been trying to work this out, is that geography that I've discovered isn't geography that matches onto agrarian disputes. So the geography is through that sort of central sort of plains hourglass from through the Midlands. It's particularly Kings County, Queens County, Longford, Roscommon, up towards Cavan, South Donegal, from Mana, from the 1740s through to the 1770s. And that there's a sort of legitimacy issue there. So that it's not fitting directly onto other sort of established sort of patterns at one level. And in terms of bandage, so that's why I've been trying to work out what's going on there. And one of the things that I'm interested in terms of thinking about the work on banditry that probably has influenced some of my thinking has been stuff like Lucy Ryle on Sicilian bandits on Admiral Nelson's estates in the sort of early 19th century, which you can get at this kind of banditry and sort of peasant resistance at a moment of, probably in a moment of transformation, but more a moment of modernity. So I think there's probably there's something there as well, that's not just at a sort of at that transformational sort of moment, that it's as kind of moments of contest. But yeah, no, I think there's something to like, and I take the point in terms of that. Yes, some of what we see in Ireland, we see elsewhere in these islands, and I think there's something, and this is where I think the edges, what's happening at the sort of margins in Britain is also interesting in terms of how state legitimacy is sort of work. One of the things that's quite influential in terms of my thinking on this, there's been recent work by Peter King and Richard Ward on capital punishment, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, past and present, where they tantalizingly suggest at the very end, well, this might apply to the fiscal-military state. And you can think about sort of, and they sort of hint at sort of degrees of mercy and clemency in places like Cornwall and North and South Wales and so forth. And I think there's elements that you can draw on that to think about Ireland. So I think there are ways of that. It's both that Ireland is both different, but also England is more. There's more complexity there too. And And it comes down to like how do we work out the non-metropolitan regions, I guess, is the
And then David.
I just wanted to follow on, you were talking about, places that were isolated at times of danger would not necessarily be left so isolated. In Fontaine's case, and you were telling of it, does that moment where he's expected to, in effect, defend the coast by himself, but the state does step in very rapidly, in you were telling, to handle international diplomacy. I wondered about lines of communication between these frayed edges and the centre. I mean, are those established and state-sponsored lines of communication, or are they private and ad hoc?
I think they're probably private and ad hoc, and to some degree where he's able to get, like, he is at one level he's an outsider. He's a Huguenot of sort of non-orthodox religious beliefs in terms of Anglicans or the Communion. But he's also very connected into local grandees. He's able to pull those levers. He's able to get a pension in 1705 pretty quickly. So there is, I think communication between the provinces and the centre is reasonably efficient if dependent on access to that sort of those network. And you see the same with somebody like Hedges in Kerry, who has a correspondence with the castle, but is also able to ignore that correspondence at different stages and use it or not use it, or ignore or respond to letters. So there is a way to, there's a growing sort of network of I suppose, there is an information network that allows things to, that is, can be deployed.
David.
Yeah, so getting back to you mentioned one point, you said non-metropolitan. Well, most of England is metropolitan.
Yes.
By definition, and I would have thought Sussex, for example, was a particularly peripheral area in the 18th century. And similarly, I think if you look at 18th century Ireland, I mean, one can concentrate on the southwest and parts of Connemara and so on. But at the same time, it's not just the periphery geographically. There's a great deal of similar kind of activities going on, for example, in the Midlands. And what's interesting is that these are areas, I'm thinking of the West Midlands, but where there are surviving Catholic or ex-Catholic landed families. And that leads me really to what I was going to ask about, which was, you mentioned manorial courts. Manorial courts dominated by Catholic interests. I wonder if you could give us some examples of that, and just what kind of Catholic interests they were, whether they were in fact families which, during the course of the 18th century, would convert. There are plenty of examples of fairly unreconstructed Catholic families, and the Cotters are a very good example. I mean, you would think of James Cotter, a notorious individual, as being father of somebody who was fairly straight Protestant. The Callahans of Clocheen, for example, become O'Callahans, who become Callahans, then become very strong Protestant. As the 18th century goes, these surviving families do turn into families that are completely indistinguishable from the ascendancy of the early 18th century. So I wonder who these families were controlling which manorial folk.
Yeah, like I suppose like what I'm drawing on there is as much what I have in the sort of in the southwest, where it seems to be very much sort of vestiges of O'Sullivans and McCarthy's and others who are still sitting on the local courts there. I've seen a little bit of evidence for Clare, which is West Clare, which seems somewhat similar, but it's like I think there's probably more to be done to try to pick out in terms of sort of manorial courts. I've only kind of just got a hunch at this recently. It's like, oh, there's something there, but it's not. I've only been trying to gather what
mean, there's just not a lot.
Yeah, they're not a lot of them, and that's the problem. And it's, I think, trying to generalize out of them, I think, would be.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, it's as much vestigial. It seems like vestigial interests that are have some sort of local sort of authority, and you know, it's a sort of. I hesitate the word to use a sort of underground gentry sort of formulation, but there's something of that ilk going on.
Just one very small mention, Southwell, encouraging group of fishermen, presumably, into the Navy. Was he just trying to get rid of them? You don't want these kind of very vigorous, muscular Catholic in Kinsale, which of course is not a particularly Catholic town. There are Catholics.
Also, I think it's a bit more than that. And it's intriguing. Like one of the problems with the South Wales and their wider network is that they're implicating absolutely everything. So they have the lease on the local naval yard. They are the local sort of. They have honorific offices as vice admirals. There's another. His uncle James Waller is promoting all sorts of recruitment schemes along the South Munster coast. And what is intriguing is that there is an awful lot of. If you go through admiralty records and you look at the records of captains stationed in the Irish coast, and there's about 100 surviving letter books of captains' letters, some of which are really extensive, which document. They're not meant to be on recruitment duty. That's not their main mission, but it's what they do, and it's vast amounts of recruitment from very early on. So some hilarious cases, you end up with the English Navy on one side of Valencia Island in the 1740s, the Spanish Navy on the other side, both trying to press gang. And you have this, so there is, I think it's more, it is a targeted attempt to use Irish maritime labour.
Things, I think, say about press gang.
Yeah.
Certainly in Cork as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this would be quieting down local discontent and making sure.
Yes, no, if you recruit, you gather together a suitable gang of men and you get them in.
Okay. Any other questions? Anything online, Becca? No. So can I ask you, Patrick? I mean, the picture you're giving us is largely one of kind of relatively isolated Protestant gentlemen using their households to kind of maintain order with only very limited support from state garrisons, etc. But is there any are there any projections on the part of the state to settle significant numbers of Protestants in these areas of South and West Munsters and Huguenots, or I don't know, I mean Palatines, I suppose, are a bit later, aren't there? But obviously there are settlement projects in other parts of Ireland, you know, Lagan Valley being the most well known in the 1690s. Is there a conception that this may be, you know, as has been used previously in Irish history, a potential settlement to the, you know, the kind of security issues in these areas of the South and West?
Yeah, I think there probably is. Mark Mulholland in his new book on Irish peasants makes a big play of this. I think it's quite intriguing, and he points out that a lot of them fail within the first generation. But like there's a settlement in Macroom. There's Huguenots in West Cork in multiple places. There's Newtown Pratt, which is another failed settlement in West Mayo. There's a significant amount of money invested in that. I've been tracking that one through the Registry of Deeds. I think they are being used. There is a sort of the Palatines, to some degree, they're being conceived. Certainly the rhetoric around them is that's very sad. I think the idea of plantation and of settlement is still, and David's done some recent work on this, is still very current in the 1690s into the early, up to at least the late 1720s. It's still hanging about. It's there in the shadows in some of the debates about over emigration in the very late 1720s. So it is part of the, and the idea with the barracks network, the barracks network is kind of doomed as a strategic resource from the beginning because it's also a pork barrel. But there is, like Johnson's Fuse, which we saw earlier, the field across the way is designated as a market. There's a plan to be a town, which never happens. And there is a number of those. You can sort of map sort of market commissions with barrack buildings, with custom house, the erection of a sort of network of proper custom houses. So there's an infrastructure. There's a sort of state infrastructure that's been built in different places, and that's one of the things that quite interested in is that you can map so there's an attempt to use that infrastructure to create, if not specifically, it's plantation ish.
Yeah.
But it's very much there, and it's about like some of the lists of barracks list off the nearest post town, list off the nearest markets, list off nearest opportunities. Like they're conceived as a sort of form of rural development, and are petitioned by people on that basis as well to get them. So which I think is important.
That's the initiative.
No, it's private.
Landowner.
Right.
Apart from politics, but initiative there is simply get them out of it. They don't last. A number of places for very long. One or two part-time settlements which last, but on the whole, it is people like Sir John Percival and Canturk, or Eggnon's he became, who want to develop the linen industry and to perhaps get across decent Protestant things. And the Brodricks would only allow their tenants to sublet to Protestants. On the other hand, they did have to occasionally. Very pleased to say that.
Okay, great. Any other questions anyone has? No, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. I look forward to seeing this material come out in published form. Can we finish by thanking Patrick? Thank you all for coming. As I say, this is the last of our studies events for this semester. It's a bit beyond the 18th century, but our next event is actually a one-day conference on the 16th of January in this room on the labour politics in West Belfast, 1918 to 1983. And then on following Monday, the 19th of January, we'll be launching Veronique Altglass's new book on Christian Zionism in Northern Ireland in the 20th century, 21st century. So if that's of interest, please come along and we'll see you there.